My sister announced at my graduation, "We're converting your scholarship money into a pool fund. You don't need college anyway." I just nodded. What she didn't know was that I'd already transferred to Harvard. The next morning, she found my acceptance letter on her pillow. I, 18M, stood in my cap and gown, diploma in hand, watching my family gather around the kitchen table for what I thought would be a celebration dinner. The graduation ceremony had gone perfectly, valedictorian speech delivered, scholarships announced, proud parents taking photos. But the atmosphere in our house felt different than I expected. My sister, 3 years older and fresh out of college herself, had been acting strange all week. She kept whispering with our parents, giving me these looks I couldn't quite read. When Dad asked everyone to sit down for an important family discussion, my stomach dropped. Mom started by congratulating me again on graduating top of my class. She mentioned how proud they were of my full scholarship to State University. Then she paused, glancing at my sister, who took over the conversation with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. My sister announced that they'd been doing some thinking about my future. She said college wasn't really necessary for someone like me, that I was smart enough to figure things out on my own. She explained that they'd decided to redirect my scholarship money towards something more practical for the family. A pool, she said. Something everyone could enjoy. The words hit me like a physical blow. I sat there, fork halfway to my mouth, processing what I'd just heard. My parents nodded along as my sister continued explaining how pools added value to homes, how I could always go to community college later if I really wanted to, how this was better for everyone in the long run. I looked around the table at their faces. My sister seemed almost gleeful. My parents looked uncomfortable but determined. They'd clearly already made up their minds. This wasn't a discussion, it was an announcement. I set down my fork and nodded slowly. I told them I understood. I said I appreciated them thinking about what was best for the family. My sister's smile widened, and she reached over to pat my shoulder, telling me how mature I was being about this. What none of them knew was that I'd seen this coming. 3 months earlier, I'd started noticing changes in how my family treated me. Small things at first, conversations that stopped when I entered rooms, my sister making comments about how college was overrated, my parents suddenly questioning whether I really needed to go away to school. The writing was on the wall. That's when I'd started working on my backup plan. I'd always been good at keeping secrets. While my family thought I was just studying for finals, I'd been secretly preparing applications to other schools. Schools that offered need-based aid, not just merit scholarships. Schools that understood students sometimes came from complicated family situations. Harvard had been a long shot, but I'd applied anyway. When the acceptance letter arrived 2 weeks before graduation, I'd intercepted it before anyone else could see it. The financial aid package was generous enough that I could attend without any family contribution. I'd already accepted their offer and deferred my state university scholarship. But I kept all of this to myself, waiting to see what my family would do. Now I knew. After dinner, I excused myself to my room. I pulled out the Harvard acceptance letter I'd been hiding in my desk drawer. The thick paper felt substantial in my hands, real in a way that made everything else feel like a bad dream. I spent the evening making final preparations. I called Harvard's admissions office to confirm my enrollment. I researched student jobs on campus. I looked into bus schedules for getting to Cambridge. Everything was falling into place. My sister knocked on my door around 10 p.m. She came in without waiting for permission, flopping down on my bed like we were about to have some heart-to-heart conversation. She told me again how proud she was of how I'd handled the news. She said most kids my age would have thrown a tantrum, but I was showing real maturity. She went on about how the pool would be amazing, how I could invite friends over, how it would make our house the cool place to hang out. She painted this picture of summer parties and family gatherings, like she was doing me some kind of favor. I listened and nodded and made appropriate responses. Inside, I was counting down the hours until morning. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about all the times my sister had undermined me growing up. The way she'd convinced our parents I was too irresponsible for certain privileges. How she'd always positioned herself as the responsible one, the one who knew what was best for everyone. She'd graduated with a communications degree and moved back home, supposedly to save money, but really because she couldn't figure out what to do with her life. Meanwhile, she was making decisions about my future like she had any authority to do so. I thought about my parents too, and how they'd let her influence them. How they'd sat there nodding while she explained why their son didn't need an education. How they'd chosen a swimming pool over my dreams. The anger kept me awake, but it also kept me focused. Tomorrow would change everything. I woke up before dawn and made my final preparations. I wrote a short note explaining that I'd be leaving for college as planned, just not the college they expected. I packed a single bag with essentials. I'd figure out the rest later. I made copies of all my important documents. Then I took the Harvard acceptance letter and walked quietly to my sister's room. She was still asleep, sprawled across her bed like she owned the world. I placed the letter carefully on her pillow, right next to her head where she couldn't miss it. The crimson Harvard logo seemed to glow in the early morning light filtering through her blinds. I stood there for a moment, looking at her peaceful face. She had no idea what was coming. No idea that her little brother had outmaneuvered her completely. I left the house before anyone else woke up. I'd arranged to stay with a friend's family for a few days before heading to Cambridge. As I walked down our street with my bag over my shoulder, I felt lighter than I had in months. My phone started buzzing around 8 a.m. First my sister, then my parents, call after call. I let them all go to voicemail. I wasn't ready to talk yet. The first voicemail was my sister screaming. She'd found the letter and was demanding to know what kind of game I was playing. She wanted to know how I'd gotten into Harvard without them knowing, how I planned to pay for it, why I was being so secretive and manipulative. The irony wasn't lost on me. My parents' messages were more confused than angry. They wanted to understand what was happening, wanted me to come home so we could talk about this as a family. Dad's voice sounded genuinely bewildered, like he couldn't figure out how things had gotten so complicated. I finally answered when my sister called for the 10th time. She immediately launched into a tirade about how I was being ungrateful and selfish. She said I was throwing away a perfectly good scholarship to State University for some fantasy about Harvard. She demanded to know how I thought I was going to pay for it. I calmly explained that I'd already worked out the financial details. I told her about the need-based aid, about the work-study programs, about how I'd managed to secure funding without any family contribution. I could hear her getting more frustrated as I spoke. She switched tactics, trying to guilt me about abandoning the family. She said our parents had sacrificed so much for me over the years, and this was how I was repaying them. She said I was being dramatic and that we could work something out about the pool situation. I told her it wasn't about the pool. It was about the fact that they'd made a major decision about my life without consulting me. It was about being told I didn't need college while sitting at my own graduation dinner. It was about being treated like my dreams and goals didn't matter. She got quiet for a moment, then asked what I wanted from them. I said I didn't want anything. I was 18, legally an adult, and I was making my own choices now. I told her I'd be in touch once I got settled at school, but for now, I needed space to process everything that had happened. She tried to argue more, but I hung up. Update 1. The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation and family drama. My parents drove to my friend's house to try to convince me to come home. They sat in the living room looking uncomfortable while I explained my position. Mom cried and said she didn't understand why I was being so secretive. She insisted they'd only been trying to do what was best for the family as a whole. Dad was quieter, but I could see him starting to realize how the whole situation must have looked from my perspective. I showed them the financial aid documents, proof that I could attend Harvard without their help. I explained that I'd applied to multiple schools as backup options because I'd sensed something was wrong with how they were talking about my future. Dad asked why I hadn't just talked to them about my concerns. I reminded him about the graduation dinner, about how they presented their decision as final. I asked him how he thought I should have responded to being told my education didn't matter. That seemed to hit home. He got quiet and looked at Mom, then back at me. He said they'd made mistakes in how they'd handled things, but they were still my parents and they loved me. I told him I loved them too, but love didn't mean I had to accept being treated like my opinions didn't matter. I said I was going to Harvard, and I hoped they could eventually be proud of me for it. Mom asked about my sister, about how angry she was. I said my sister was an adult who could handle her own emotions. I wasn't responsible for managing her feelings about my choices. We talked for another hour, and by the end, they seemed to understand my position better. They didn't like it, but they understood it. Dad even admitted that maybe they'd let my sister influence them too much in the decision-making process. They left without trying to force me to come home, which felt like progress. My sister, meanwhile, had been calling mutual friends and extended family members, trying to get them to convince me I was making a mistake. She was painting herself as the victim, saying I was tearing the family apart over a misunderstanding. But some of our relatives started asking questions about what exactly had happened. When they heard the full story, that my family had decided to redirect my scholarship money to build a pool, the reactions weren't what my sister expected. Our aunt called me directly to say she was proud of me for standing up for myself. She said she'd gone through something similar with her own family years ago, and sometimes you have to make hard choices to protect your future. Our grandfather, who'd always been big on education, was apparently furious when he heard what had happened. He called my parents and gave them what my sister later described as a lecture about priorities and raising children. The family dynamics were shifting, and my sister was finding herself on the defensive instead of in control. Update 2. 2 weeks later, I was packed and ready to leave for Harvard. My parents had come around somewhat. They weren't thrilled about the situation, but they'd accepted it. They even offered to help me move, though I declined. I needed to do this on my own. My sister made one last attempt to change my mind. She showed up at my friend's house the night before I was supposed to leave, looking like she'd been crying. She said she was sorry about how everything had gone down, that she'd been trying to help but had gone about it the wrong way. She explained that she'd been worried about me taking on debt for college, that she'd thought redirecting the scholarship money towards something practical made sense. She said she'd never meant to hurt me or make me feel like my dreams didn't matter. I listened to her apology, and I could tell part of it was genuine. But I also recognized the manipulation tactics she'd used on me my whole life. The tears, the claims of good intentions, the way she positioned herself as the victim of circumstances rather than the architect of them. I told her I appreciated the apology, but it didn't change what had happened. I said I needed to see consistent changes in how she treated me, not just words when she was facing consequences for her actions. She asked what she could do to fix things. I said she could start by taking responsibility for her role in the situation without making excuses. I said she could stop trying to control other people's major life decisions. I said she could work on understanding that being older didn't automatically make her wiser or more qualified to run other people's lives. She didn't like that answer. She got defensive again, saying I was being unfair and holding grudges. She said families were supposed to forgive each other and move on. I told her forgiveness didn't mean pretending nothing had happened. It didn't mean going back to the same dynamic where she made decisions for me and I was expected to go along with them. I said I was willing to rebuild our relationship, but it would have to be on different terms. She left angry, but I felt good about how I'd handled the conversation. The next morning, I took a bus to Cambridge. As the miles rolled by, I felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. I was really doing this, going to Harvard, pursuing my dreams, building a life on my own terms. I thought about the pool my family was probably planning to build with my scholarship money. I wondered if they'd enjoy it, if it would bring them the happiness my sister had promised. I hoped it would, honestly. I didn't want them to be miserable, but I also knew I'd made the right choice. I'd stood up for myself when it mattered most. I'd refused to let other people's limitations become my own. Update 3. I've been at Harvard for 3 months now, and it's been everything I hoped it would be and more. The academics are challenging, but manageable. I've made friends who share my interests and ambitions. I'm working part-time in the library to help cover expenses, and I've already started looking into research opportunities for next semester. My relationship with my family has been slowly improving. My parents and I talk regularly now, and they've started asking about my classes and my plans for the future. They seem genuinely interested in my life here, which feels good. Dad admitted recently that he'd been influenced too much by my sister's opinions about college and career paths. He said he'd forgotten that I was my own person with my own goals and dreams. He apologized for not standing up for me during the graduation dinner conversation. Mom has been sending care packages and asking if I need anything. She's proud of my grades and the fact that I'm managing everything on my own. She said she's learned something about not underestimating me. My sister and I are still working on our relationship. She's been less controlling in our conversations, though I can tell it's an effort for her. She started therapy, which she mentioned casually in a recent text. I think she's beginning to understand how her behavior affected me over the years. She asked recently if I'd be coming home for Thanksgiving. I said I was planning to, but that I'd need to stay in a hotel rather than at the house. I explained that I needed to maintain some boundaries while we worked on rebuilding trust. She didn't argue, which felt like progress. The pool, by the way, was never built. Apparently, once they actually looked into the costs and logistics, they realized it wasn't as practical as my sister had made it sound. The scholarship money is sitting in an account, and my parents have offered to send it to me for college expenses. I declined. I'm managing fine on my own, and I want to keep it that way. I told them to save it for something they really want, or to donate it to a scholarship fund for other students. I don't need their money, and I don't want there to be any strings attached to my education. Looking back, I'm grateful for how everything played out. If my family hadn't tried to redirect my scholarship money, I might never have pushed myself to apply to Harvard. I might have settled for a good enough option instead of reaching for something extraordinary. Their attempt to limit my choices ended up expanding them instead. Their decision to treat me like I didn't know what was best for myself forced me to prove that I did. I learned that I'm stronger and more resourceful than I'd realized. I learned that I don't need other people's permission to pursue my dreams. I learned that sometimes the people who claim to know what's best for you are really just projecting their own fears and limitations. Most importantly, I learned that respect isn't automatically given based on age or family relationships. It has to be earned through actions, and it can be lost just as easily. My sister thought she was teaching me a lesson about family priorities and practical decision-making. Instead, she taught me about standing up for myself and refusing to let other people's narrow vision define my future. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, doing exactly what I'm supposed to be doing. And I got here by trusting myself when everyone else told me not to. The acceptance letter I left on her pillow that morning wasn't just proof that I'd gotten into Harvard. It was proof that I'd been planning and working toward my goals while she was busy making plans for my life. It was proof that underestimating someone can be a costly mistake. She wanted to convert my scholarship into a pool fund because she thought I didn't need college. What she didn't realize was that I'd already converted myself into someone who didn't need her permission to succeed. That's a lesson worth more than any swimming pool.